Rogue One is a 2016 prequel movie to the existing movies in the Star Wars series. The events in this movie lead up directly to the events of the original Star Wars movie, Episode 4, A New Hope. And this is a movie that going into, I had a slightly different view to the majority of other people going into it. And that is that I'm not a Star Wars fan. I don't dislike the movies, I just think they're good, but they're not among my favourites. That being said, that puts me in a relatively unique position. And there are certainly other people as well who like the films but don't necessarily love them. And as such, people like that, such as myself, can go into a movie like this and instead of viewing it as a Star Wars event film, which it certainly is, you can view it more objectively and consider it just as a film, without all the baggage, the fanboy support, etc. that Star Wars fans will naturally have. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just like that with other franchises, such as The Thing or Alien. I'll basically forgive any movie that they make purely because I want to see those characters on the big screen. So, coming in from that angle of being a non-super fan of Star Wars, what was my impression of this film? Well, I saw it later than many people, around a week or so after its initial release. And the main reason why that was the case is because I was sick. I would have seen it earlier, but I didn't want to be coughing out the theatre. And now that I finally got round to seeing it, I have to say, of the existing Star Wars movies, and I have seen all of them up to this point, it is my favourite, I think. Now, that being said, is it the best Star Wars movie? Well, that's a strong thing to say, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it is. I don't personally have any particular Star Wars movie that I would say is the best, because as I said, I'm not a huge fan of the series as a whole. Now, this particular movie, as I said, is a prequel to the events of the initial Star Wars movie back in the 70s, and I think most people probably know that by this point. Now, the cast of this movie, I would say, is very impressive. You've got a very strong selection of people from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of acting styles, methods, etc. Now, included in that cast is Felicity Jones, Mads Mikkelsen, Diego Luna, Ben Mendelsohn, Donnie Yen, Alan Tudyk, Riz Ahmed, and Forrest Whitaker, and many others. It's a very strong cast, I would say, one of the strongest of any film that I've seen this year. You've also got plenty of other characters who, although I may not necessarily know them by name, are characters which any Star Wars fan will definitely recognise, even someone like me who, as I said, is not a huge Star Wars fan. I still recognise certain characters, of course, from the 6 movies which come after this. Now, as far as the way the film breaks down, things that I did like, didn't like, obviously I'm not going to spoil anything because I don't spoil any movies that I review, but as far as the story itself, and this is nothing that you can't see in the trailers, and any Star Wars fan will already know this, but the film revolves around the events immediately preceding the original Star Wars movie, and that is the retrieval of plans of how to destroy the Death Star. That's not a spoiler, it's well known, well documented, etc. That's the crux of the movie. But the movie manages to present that event that we all already know about, but then it puts a twist on that by presenting it from the point of view of characters who we've never seen before. So although the story itself is common Star Wars knowledge, the way they present the story, the viewpoints of the characters who are going through the scenario and the situations herein, is different to what we've seen. Their backstories, their motivations, their interconnected relationships with good and bad characters, maybe some who are in more of a grey area in between the two, is completely new. There are plenty of brand new characters who may be in Star Wars lore. I don't read the novels, etc., so they may well be in there, but there are characters who we certainly haven't seen in the movies before. So overall, I would say that that was something which I liked, because the film could have very easily been just a paint-by-numbers story, playing out the exact scenario that we would suspect happens. After all, we already know that they get the plans to the Death Star, because in the original Star Wars film, they have the plans, so you know the outcome. But instead of allowing that to make the film kind of paint by numbers or even mediocre, the presenting of that story through the eyes of different people that we haven't seen before kept it fresh, and almost made you forget that you already knew the outcome. And that was kind of cool, at least for me personally. Other things that I liked were the use of extras, the special effects in particular, a combination of practical and CGI. Practical I'm a huge fan of, CGI when necessary, and there are some occasions in this, both with traditional CGI, environmental and with characters, and also motion capture, that blend very well. Now, some of it is more noticeable than others, for sure, but I enjoyed it all very much. As far as the visuals of the film in general, well, pretty much every Star Wars film, regardless of the story quality, always looks pretty good. The scenes and the worlds that we inhabit look very real in Star Wars films. They do look like real, lived-in places. Now, speaking more specifically about certain characters that I enjoyed, I would say that there were 3 characters in this movie in particular who I enjoyed the performances of the most. The first, and I would say probably my favourite character in the whole film, and this isn't necessarily that different to many other people's opinions, is probably K2SO, who is the reprogrammed robot who you see in the trailer. He's a great character. He is the comic relief to some degree, but at the same time he's also the muscle. So that's an interesting juxtaposition between the two, and I love the way that Alan Tudyk portrayed him. I would say that my second favourite character was that played by Donnie Yen, who you see also in the trailer quite heavily featured. Now, his character is totally different to K2SO. He is a much deeper character. He has humour, and I would actually say that, without spoiling anything, he actually has the funniest line in the whole film. But his character has a much more reverent tone to him. He has humour, but he takes the Force very seriously, which again you can see in the trailer, and I just found him to be a very likeable character who kind of dominated the scenes that he was in, not by choice or by trying to, but just with a natural presence that he had. And as for the final of the 3 characters which I really enjoyed the most, that would have to be Darth Vader, who you see, of course, fractionally in a couple of the trailers, and he's not in the film a huge amount. People in other reviews have already said this, so it's nothing new. I personally thought that his use in the movie was very similar to how the Joker was used in Suicide Squad. The difference was, the Joker to me felt kind of unnecessary in Suicide Squad. He was there purely to draw people into the movie. With this movie, Darth Vader isn't just there to draw people. To some degree, he will naturally do that. He'll get people to go to the cinema just to see him. But the way in which he's used, although it is very sparing, I thought was very good. So overall, that's it for my initial impressions. As far as downsides, I didn't really have any outstanding ones. There, as I said, were a couple of times where CGI was a bit noticeable, but you can kind of say that about any movie. Now, as far as the individual breakdown and reviews of each category of our 5 primary ones, first of all, as always, we have the story and the plot. And for the story and plot of Rogue One, I'm going to give it a 7. And the reason why is because the story was made to be more interesting than it easily could have been. The problem with presenting events that precede an existing movie is that people already know the outcome, as we already said. So, to be able to present that in a fresh, new, interesting way, to me that's impressive. The story itself isn't overly complex. It's a relatively simple movie. It has a darker tone, I would say, than other Star Wars films. And I would say that the tone of the film in general is actually slightly darker even than the trailers present it as being. The trailers have a relatively light tone. Even with the action in the trailers, they still appear to be kind of an adventure film. Whereas, although it is that, it's a darker adventure film, a more emotionally heavy adventure. So overall, for the story and plot, as I said, I'm giving it a 7. I didn't find it to be as complex as other films, and as such, it wouldn't be fair to rate it higher, but it was certainly above what it could have easily been, and I liked the way it played out. The pacing changed a little here and there due to reshoots, etc., but it wasn't too unnerving for me personally. As far as the characters and their motivations, well, as I already said, you've got a very strong cast. I personally found the characters across the board to be interesting. The way that some of them are introduced and the way their backstories are expounded on is a little sloppy or rushed sometimes, but again, it didn't ruin it for me. I liked almost all of the characters. Some of them I wanted to see more of, some of them not necessarily less, but I just didn't really care either way. And overall, I liked the characters, so I'm going to give them an 8, which is a perfectly respectable score. As far as the visuals and effects of the movie, the way it looks overall, the special effects including CGI, practical, makeup in general of course, well, as I already mentioned earlier, I think that all Star Wars movies, regardless of age, always have a fantastic look to them. They really look like they have a lot of effort put into it. They are films that are made from passion. You get the very strong impression that everyone involved in making a Star Wars movie wants to be there and wants to make it as good as they can. It doesn't necessarily always turn out perfectly, but they always want it to, and that's good to see. I think you can tell the difference when that happens. And so overall, I'm going to give the visuals and effects, the special effects, practical effects, etc. in the movie a 10, because it is a fantastic looking movie. The CGI, although noticeable in some points more than others, is still excellent. The motion capture is, I would say, pretty much perfect, especially given that a robot character in particular is never going to look entirely realistic because it's a robotic character. It's not supposed to. In general, the special effects, the practical effects, the makeup effects, the environmental appearance, and in particular for me, the opening visuals of the film. Again, without spoiling anything, but the look of the scene when the movie first opens really drew me in. It was reminiscent for me of 2001, A Space Odyssey, which is also a very rich visual experience. So overall, it's a 10 from me. As far as the audio, the soundtrack in general of the movie, I'm going to give it a 7, because it wasn't as good as other Star Wars movies. The other Star Wars movies, regardless, to be honest, of if you're a fan of the prequels or not, even the prequels have incredible music. I think my personal favourite piece of music from all of the Star Wars movies is Duel of the Fates from Episode 1. All Star Wars movies have incredible music. This movie, though, did go through some changes as far as the soundtrack. The composer changed, of course, to Michael Giacchino, and he didn't have very long to complete his work on the film. He makes some interesting changes, some not necessarily remixes, but slight reimaginings of existing themes from Star Wars, and although I like the fact that he tried something different, he had a bit of flair, it didn't have enough nostalgia to me. It kind of had a nostalgic hook in some points, the music in particular, but then when it suddenly changed to a different kind of music, I felt that kind of jarring a little. The music certainly wasn't bad, but it wasn't as good as the other Star Wars movies for me. And so overall, for that soundtrack, it's a 7. The audio design in general is included in that. And so finally, the last of our 5 categories, which is, as always, the most subjective to me personally, is the rewatchability and entertainment factor. And for that, I'm going to give Rogue One a 6, which may not sound that great. That is the lowest of all of these 5 scores for this particular movie. But a 6 is above my baseline of 5. As I've said in my other videos, for me 5 is whatever it needs to be. 5 is acceptable. Anything below 5 is starting to get bad. Anything above 5 is better and better, and obviously 10 is the best. So I would give the overall score in that regard for me personally a 6, because it was more rewatchable, definitely, than some other movies, but being as I am not a huge Star Wars fan anyway, And so I would say that the rewatchability is definitely there. I would like to see the movie again, but then beyond a couple of viewings, it's not a movie that I would watch regularly because it's just not really my kind of thing. Overall, I would say that the feeling I had coming out from this movie was actually fairly similar to the feelings that I had for Doctor Strange earlier this year. I'm a big fan of comic book movies, but even so, I didn't love that movie. I liked it very much, I thought it was a very good film, but I didn't love it. Likewise with Rogue One, I didn't love the film, but I did see a lot of great things in there, and I did enjoy it. And overall, that means that as a tabulation of our 5 individual categories put together, I am giving Rogue One a pretty respectable score. It probably doesn't sound that great, but a pretty respectable score of 3.8 out of 5, which is by no means the highest of the movies I've reviewed, but is a little above an average score, and justifiably so. That's on par with a couple of other movies which I feel comfortable with putting it on par with. Not necessarily similar films, but movies that come out with a similar overall score, at least by my standards. Overall, would I recommend checking it out? Yes, I would. If you're a Star Wars fan, you've probably already seen it. If you haven't, you'll probably enjoy it. Speaking primarily, though, as a non-Star Wars fan, I enjoyed it the most, I think, out of any Star Wars movie so far. So that should give you some inclination of what to expect. It certainly had a different tone. The visuals and characters were a great throwback in some cases to the older Star Wars films, but without relying too much purely on nostalgia. And overall, I enjoyed it. But that's it overall for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.